So you see here, we have the board. I already set it up for 3 players. And I have our 3 player mats are right here. We have yellow, we have blue, and we have red. All right guys, so the first thing that we're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna set up the board. Now there's 3 different layouts. There's a layout for 3 players, there's a layout for 4 players, and then for 5 and 6 players. Now this right here is a layout for only 3 players, and as you can see, the game is pretty sprawling for 3 players alone. Okay, once you set up the board, you're going to pick your starting territories. You see those are the territories that are flipped over and available. Now the first person will be chosen randomly, and then after that you will randomly hand out both the second to last player and the last player card. Now what these are, if you notice too, there's a 3+, that indicates these tiles are used in games with 3 players or more. And what these are for is for the players who get the second and last pick. They would have the opportunity to change one of the territories out for whatever's on the underside of these cards. In this case, it's an oil field and a plain. So for the sake of discussion here, let's discuss what everything produces. Now, the water is going to produce food, and your food tiles are going to look like this. Now this resource is like that. It's a raw resource. And once it's gathered, it is flipped over and then it becomes edible. And that would go on water. This here is metal or iron, and this would go on this tile here. And you see once this is its raw state and that's its gathered state. All right, here we have the oil fields, and this is where oil is produced. This is its raw state and its gathered state. And then finally you have the mountainous areas, and that's where this is produced. This is stone. You flip it over and that's its gathered state. So the difference between gathered and raw. So if something's in, and I'll use food for this example because that's the easiest. If something is in a raw state, then it cannot be eaten. But as soon as it's gathered, it's edible. So you can use this to feed your people. So a key component of this game is going to be feeding your people. All right, now this section here, this is a wasteland, and these produce nothing. You see there's some over here as well. These produce nothing. However, the ones that have a +1 in the middle are considered to have crystal mines. So when you have any kind of combat, which we'll talk about later, that will actually produce 1 victory point if you have combat on this tile. This here is a polluted location, which it produces no resources. However, there is a full-size tile of this with 2 locations on it, and that comes with 2 gathered resources of your choice. So it's worthless as the game goes on, but if you flip one mid-game, it's not necessarily too bad because you at least get 2 of something already gathered. Now we're going to pick our starting locations, and we're just going to say, for convenience sake, we're going to say that red picks first and they pick this location, and then we'll let blue will get the second to last. They'll pick this. It's close to their player board, so it's easy for me. Now this gives them the option to replace a tile. So what we will want to do here is I would want to replace probably this tile right here, because this is going to produce nothing and this will produce food, but that's already producing food. So let's get rid of this, and we will put this in its place. We can put it any orientation that we want. For right now, doesn't really matter, so we'll just put that right there. And then right here, this will be where yellow is, simply because, again, it's close to the yellow player board. And we will say that yellow is not going to want this, even though it's worth an extra victory point. Resources are probably more important in this game than anything, so we'll flip this. And yellow is going to have quite a bit of food and oil. Okay, now we're going to place our dead zone tokens, and that's these here. And this is an area where the fallout is so bad the area has been destroyed. So typically you're going to want to place that on a location that's not going to produce for you. So for red, red is going to pick the Wastelands area there, because that's not going to produce anything. And then you have to place 4 radiation tokens around where the dead zone is. Now, these start off with the number 1, and as radiation events occur, they will increase. And if it ever gets to 3, that location becomes a dead zone as well, and everything there is destroyed. So we'll get to that later. But so we'll place that one there, radiation token, there, and there. And looking at blue's location, Blue is going to place a dead zone there, and then a radiation. Actually, we'll do this just for discussion. Place the dead zone there, radiation in 4 spaces surrounding, and they can be unexplored areas. So we can go like that. And then lastly, yellow is going to pick for its dead zone, we'll just call the water, and then we'll put 4 surrounding, 2, 3, and 4. Now there is one thing to note is when you're placing the dead zones and the radiation tokens, on the larger player maps, there's some cases where the starting zones might be touching. They might have one shared tile, or not shared tile, but touching tile. If that's the case, you may not place a radiation token in an opponent's starting territory. So that's very important to remember. You kind of can't play screw your neighbor from the very beginning. Another item to note, if you are playing a 5-player game, you will set up as you do for a 6-player game, so there will be a zone that is unused. And for a 5-player game, you would flip the tile closest to the center of the board upside down, and then put a fallout token, or put a dead zone token on that, and then put all adjacent tiles would get a radiation token. So that kind of adds another area of complexity to start the game. Now we'll set up the player boards. Now for the first game, the instructions advise you to not play with the leader cards, just to make the game a little easier. Now we are going to play with them just so I can explain them for the sake of this. However, if you were to skip them, you would remove this deploy leader card from the technology deck. But because we're going to play with leaders, this deploy leader will automatically start out here. And then you have a leader card as well. Let me see if I can find a leader card in here. All right, and there's a leader card for each player color, and each leader has a different power. So now you look here for the red leader, it's the economist. We're going to keep this in play. If we weren't playing with leaders, we would remove this card. Because we're playing with this, we are going to need to remove a card of the same type. So if we see here, this leader matches the Regrow and Excavate. So what we'll do is from this deck, from the red deck, we will remove a Regrow and Excavate card. All right, now each of these starting territories will actually start out with 2 raw resources that they produce. So the plains get 2, the oil fields get 2, I should say food, oil. Water also gets food. And over here, we'll put a couple of oil there. Now I do want to note out too, once again, this is a prototype copy. So while the resources right now are these double-sided cardboard chits, they will be much nicer in the actual release. Now these are the bunkers. You'll start off with 1 bunker. Now if you look here, the bunker has these 3 spots. That means they can store 3 gathered resources. They have these 2 red icons, which are considered your combat power. So they produce 2 combat power if there's combat in the square that they're in, or in the section they're in. And there's 1 nuclear logo here, and that icon means that they will protect from 1 radiation. So if we look back over here at the board, if this were here, you would be okay, your characters would be able to survive. However, if this were here, but this piece here were a 2, there would only be protection from 1 element, and therefore anything else left on that square would be dead. And I'll explain that a little more clearly as we go on here. These are your airships. Airships can carry 2 survivors and 1 gathered resource. These are a bunker. Now you look here, these can store 1 resource, and they offer 1 radiation protection. This is a standard survivor, so what this survivor can do is he can gather, and that's really it. He can gather and he can explore and move to new locations. At some point in the game, you will be able to upgrade the survivor, and on the flip side, he is an equipped survivor, and if you see, he adds 1 combat strength and 1 radiation protection, but he cannot gather. So you have the benefit of he's better in combat, he can help increase the radiation protection, but he can't pick up any of the food that you might find. And then this here, this is your leader token. Now your leader, you have an action that will allow you to replace a survivor with this character. And this one provides a combat strength, it provides a radiation protection, and also allows you to gather. All right, and finally, these are your command tokens, and what these do is these allow you to increase your combat strength in a location. Now this here you have to keep track of your past cards as the gameplay progresses, and I will explain that when we get to that. All right, so to start, every player gets 1 bunker. They get 5 survivors, and then they will also get a choice of 4 other either airships or bunkers, and it can be a combination of both. So you can have 3 bunkers and an airship, 4 airships, 4 bunkers, the choice is yours. And you also start off with 3 food. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull that together and we will place that on the board next. Okay, now we're just going to start with the blue player, and I tried to mix up these, the pieces that each will deploy. So for starters, you're going to want to place your bunker, and in this case, he's going to place it here in the grassy area. Now later on as the game progresses, you will produce more survivors from your bunker. So I'll place the bunker there on the grassy area, and then I will place the airship in the water. Now survivors and equipped survivors and bunkers and outposts cannot go into the water spaces, only airships can. Survivors can go into these spaces if there's an airship there because it's assumed that they are in the airship. And the airship also cannot move unless there's a survivor there to pilot it. I went ahead and grabbed 2 airships with these for these guys. Now I'll put an airship here. This is also, even though this is polluted water, this is still water and cannot be walked through. And I'll just place a bunker here, bunker here. Actually, I'm going to take that back. I'm going to put this bunker here. Now in each space, you can only have 1 bunker and 1 outpost. So you can have a bunker and an outpost in the same space, but you cannot have 2 bunkers or 2 outposts in the same space. You can have multiple airships and multiple survivors in a space. So we'll place a guy here, we'll put a guy here piloting that airship, put a guy here, put a guy here, and for sake of argument. And you start the game with 3 food, so you want to store your food because if it's not in storage, it will spoil. So we'll just put 3 food in here. Now let me back up here. I actually don't want to do this because if you see, I put a survivor in an area where there's a radiation token. Now what would happen is at the end of the turn, this guy would be dead because there's no radiation protection. Whereas here there's a radiation protection, there isn't here. So what I will do for that instead is, just for the sake of this, I will put a bunker here to show and illustrate how this will offer protection here. So he's okay. Now you can have as many survivors as you want, as long as the number of radiation equals the number of radiation protection or less. So if I had 2 radiation here, as long as I had 2 icons like that, I'm okay, even if I had 100 survivors. All right, now as you can see, we have the initial board layout completed. All right, now we'll set up the point tracker. This is double-sided, and so you're going to want to pick the side with the player count that you're doing. So whereas here I'm doing a 3-player game, so I'm going to want the side here. And this is your environment track. So you start on 0, and you move along this track for whenever you increase or whenever you decrease the radiation. This is the actual point board. If you see, it goes negative because you can lose points fairly easily in this game. And everybody will start at 0. And then over here, you have a culture track. And everybody starts at 0 on the culture track. And as you move up the culture track, you'll see there's stars and there's +1s. If you ever get to here, you get an extra victory point. And same thing over here in the environment track. You get a victory point with each one you move. Now I did look in some of the newer available instructions, and it looks a little bit different. And here I'll show you. Now here is the environment track and the culture track in the most recent rule book that's been made available on the Kickstarter. And if you look here, this culture track is a little bit different. It shows different actions that you can do in different places versus victory points. So I'm not sure what the final output will be. My guess would be this one, but I could be wrong. And again, a lot of this is subject to change. All right, now we have this track here. Now we're gonna move along this track as the game progresses up until the very end, which once we hit here, this initiates end game. So in setting this up, we have 3 spaces for random events. So we are going to take 3 random event cards and place them on the board. And we are going to want to set this deck by the board because we may need it later. So every time a player pulls a winter card, they will increase this track here. And then that will initiate these actions or events as the game moves on. And we'll get into more detail with those as we actually encounter them through the sample gameplay. Okay, so now we're going to build our hands, and you start by drawing 6 cards out of your player deck. And you look and make sure there's no winter cards, because if there's a winter card, you will have to increase the winter track. So you see here we don't have any. And these will each coincide with one of the actions that are on your player board. So each card has either a major action or a minor action. Now let's talk about these actions. So if you look at the board here, you are going to be able to perform these major actions throughout the course of the game. So for example, if you play a gather action, that lets you flip a raw resource into a gathered resource that you can then use. So like this flips this into food you can eat, oil that you can use to clean radiation, iron or stone that up here will let you build items, okay? Now, if this option here, the Regrow Excavate, will place 1 food on any water or plains place that you control, and then you can put 1 matching raw resource of each at each space where you have an outpost. So for example, if Blue were to play that, he would be able to put one of these here, a raw resource here, as well as 1 on any location that there's an outpost, including if there were an outpost here, he would put another food on here, another raw food. The bunker option gives you 4 different choices. Option A through D. You can choose to gain 1 survivor. You can choose to gain 1 uncollected resource, or 1 raw resource of these types, anything but food. You can gain 1 point on the culture track, or you can gain all 3. Now, why would you not want to gain all 3? Later in the game, it will become increasingly more difficult to feed your survivors. So you may want this victory point that this will give you, or potentially, or you may want these resources to do something with, but you don't want that extra mouth to feed. The build option lets you spend items that you have in storage or on a space that you occupy, and you can build items. And again, that your building list is here. So you can, one metal here will let you flip your survivor and he becomes an equipped survivor. Or if you want to flip him back to a regular survivor, you'd pay 1 again to flip him back. You can build an airship for 1 iron. You can build a bunker for 3 stone, an outpost for 1 stone. You can also, if you choose, spend 2 oil or 3 of anything else to reduce radiation by 1 and increase your environment track by 1, which often will give you a victory point. Then you have the command option. So this first, you get to place a command token, and you can place it anywhere on the board. So let's say, now this is yellow over here. Let's say yellow wanted to pick on blue and say, I might come make my way this way, and that's going to give me a leg up so I can win battle. Whenever you actually do fight, and we'll get into that when we actually do a fighting example, a combat example, you compare the number of command points, and the person with the most command points will win that battle. So in addition, you can also spend up to 2 movement points on separate units. So that means you can move 2 units. You can't move the same unit twice. So you can move your survivors or equipped survivors to an adjacent location. Now, you couldn't move from here to here, say. The different territory types is 1 movement. It's not by hex. And then your airships can actually move 2. So if you wanted to move your airship, from here, then to land in here, you could do that. And if you so choose, you may spend an oil to place another command token or to gain an additional movement point. And then finally, we have the resource or war action. Now, the resource action allows you to gain one technology. Now, if you play the resource action, this technology is always available. This is cellular regeneration. You pay one of each gathered resource and you can get 3 victory points. Now, your other options here as the game goes on, you could flip through here and pick a number of other items by selecting the resource option. So this here, for example, there will be an icon right here if they cost something. So you could play this, which, you know, pillaging drones you would then place under here. And next time you take your Regrow and Excavate, this would come into play as well. And there's countless technologies here. And this one, for example, you would have to pay 1 iron in order to build it. And then you would put this under your build, and you know, it would be an additional thing that you could pick if you take the build action. And then if you choose war, you can initiate all conflicts you're involved in. So anywhere that you have a command token like this would be a conflict, and you would go ahead and see who wins that. And again, we'll cover that as we get to an example as we progress here. So now back to the cards that Yellow had drawn. So you get to put 2 of these into your reserve section, which is up here on your player board. Now what that does is you can kind of then hold on to those till later in the game. So in looking at this, and again, we're not going to talk strategy, but for just sake of the action here, we'll put his religious leader card into the reserves, and then we will also put a build action, thinking, hey, maybe we'll want to make sure we could do a build action in a couple turns. We'll put that in the reserve. Okay, and then, so we'll draw blue's top 6 cards, and we'll say blue is going to put a bunker and a gather into his reserves, and then red will get to take 6 cards. And if you look here right off the top, red has drawn a winter card. There's only 1 there. So if you see here, winter card, you discard when drawn, and advance the event track marker 1 space, then draw 1 card. So we'll put this here in the discard pile. We'll draw a replacement card, and we're okay, it's not another winter card. Now, one thing to keep in mind for the winter cards, when you do the initial setup, there are a certain number of winter cards in each player deck. So if you have a 3-player game, there's going to be 4 winter cards in each deck. If you have a 4-player game, there's going to be 3 winter cards in each player's deck. And if you play a 5 or 6-player game, there's only going to be 2. And I want to mention that because we missed that the first time we played a 5-player game, and as a result, the game really flew by and we didn't get a chance to do a whole lot towards the end. The end part of the game kind of snuck up on us pretty quickly. Also, when you're doing the initial setup here, if you draw more winter cards than you have players, so let's say we all flipped a couple winter cards and we flipped, say, 4 of them in a 3-player game, you would then reshuffle all these cards, move the event back to 0, the event tracker, and then redeal again and kind of start over, so that way you can have a good spot to start from. So because red drew the winter card, we will go ahead and move the event tracker to the first space.